A few years back, there was an interesting news report about a man who caught a case of tuberculosis. Now, at first, his doctors thought it might just be a regular case of tuberculosis. So, the doctors advised the man strongly to stay home and stay put and not go out in case he were already contagious. However, this man had his own plans already in motion for a wedding in Greece and a long romantic honeymoon throughout Europe, and so he ignored his doctors and flew to Europe on a long flight, potentially putting at risk every passenger on that plane. But while he was traveling through Europe, he received news from his doctors in the U.S. that this wasn't just your average, everyday tuberculosis. This was an especially drug-resistant strain and could be very virulent. This was not a game. The authorities ordered him to present himself to the health authorities in Italy, where he was honeymooning at the time, so he could be put in an isolation ward, both for the sake of public health and for his own good. He was no longer able to return legally to the United States since his passport had now been marked on the no-fly list for safety. Well, he didn't seem to have a lot of trust in European doctors, and so he continued his honeymoon, sneaking around Europe, finally sneaking into Canada from Prague to avoid detection by the U.S. authorities, and once again, putting a multitude of people at risk in his travels through Europe on a long flight. Then he sneaks into the U.S. by car, finally turning himself in to authorities in New York. Now, the medical authorities were less than amused. Our fearless traveler was put under the most serious kind of quarantine, the first kind of its case since 1963. This was not a laughing matter. It could have put everyone at high risk. He was taken to a very specialized isolation ward in Atlanta and put promptly under armed guard to make sure he didn't sneak out again until he was given the all clear. So after all this, what was his response to all those health alarms and international incidents he caused? Well, to me, his response is very instructive and indicative of something in many of us. He said, quote, "I'm a very well-educated, successful, intelligent person. This is insane to me that I have an armed guard outside my door when I've cooperated with everything other than that whole solitary confinement in Italy thing." Wow. Well, he ignored what else he ignored from the doctors, and not a single word of concern for all those people he could have put in deadly risk. Now, it appears that this man suffered not only from an especially potent form of tuberculosis, but also from another virulent epidemic that has put human beings in isolation since the very beginning of time: egotism. It seems that this man suffered from an especially virulent form of common sense and obedience-resistant form of egotism. Now, today's readings give us a very interesting interplay between the spiritual and the corporeal realms. For the Jews at that time, one realm always had something to do with the other in some form. Are we not both corporeal and spiritual creatures? An infection can make one not only sick, but impure spiritually, and also, unfortunately, a pariah, isolated both religiously and socially from the community. Now, to be fair to those Jews, well, there were no quarantine wards back then, and we too still use quarantines and isolation wards for those who present a risk to public health. We isolate them. But for the Jews then, there was little else they could do. Now, concern for others. This was something lacking, not only in our traveler, but also, it seems, oddly enough, in the leper that came to Jesus in the gospel today. In the case of this leper, he was cured, but he was still so focused on himself that he ignored orders and what was prescribed for him by Christ and the law. the leper made it almost impossible for Jesus to continue functioning as a healer as Jesus would have liked, able to heal whomever he wanted. Thanks to him, others would find it even harder to get to Jesus, to be cured. The leper was thinking of himself mostly and wanted to celebrate his healing as much as the traveler wanted to celebrate his marriage, but in the same way forgetting everyone else that Jesus was looking to heal. Now, before we condemn the man with tuberculosis or the leper in the gospel for putting others' health or salvation at risk, I'd like to point out something. Do we not do the same thing? The reason that our Lord commanded the cleansed leper to keep silent at the time was because speaking up at that time would hinder Jesus' mission. The time for proclamation had not yet come. Yet here we are after the resurrection, when the Gospels and church council after church council time and time again tell us, no, rather really command us to speak up for the sake of the eternal salvation of others. And, well, as a preacher once said about the leper in this gospel, the Lord told him not to tell anybody, and he told everybody. He tells us to tell everybody, and we tell nobody. I want to say, friend, the disobedience of this cleansed leper is not as bad as our disobedience today. We are to tell everybody, and we tell nobody. The problem both with the cleansed leper and the man in quarantine with tuberculosis, and, well, with us, is that we're okay with the rules. We're okay with the gospel. We want the gospel. We want the good news. We want the benefits, but only so long as it benefits me, personally. Instead of being like St. Paul, who is not seeking his own benefit, but that of the many, that they may be saved, as he tells the Corinthians today. Yes, I bet most of us would sound just like the man in quarantine when confronted with something else that God or his church asks us to do or believe. We might sound like this. I'm a well-educated, successful, and intelligent person. This is insane to me that I have to do all these things that God and his church ask me to do. I mean, I've cooperated with the church by going to Mass every week, haven't I? I've done everything else that they've asked. Well, other than that whole proclaiming the gospel, believing in what the church teaches, helping the poor, feeding the hungry, and all that other stuff. It's ironic. Both the leper and the man with tuberculosis were doing everything in their power they could to get out or stay out of quarantine and exile, forgetting everyone else. And here we are, so eager to put ourselves into spiritual quarantine, also forgetting everyone else's needs. Why do we treat our faith as if it were leprosy or tuberculosis? Oops, I think I have a little bit of scapular showing. Maybe a procession might break out. A little blotch of Catholicism showing. Might cough a little Jesus on somebody by mistake. Whoops, might have a breakout of the faith. I better stand outside of society and declare myself unclean, unclean, before somebody else gets Catholicitis. Something is wrong with that picture. Brothers and sisters, it's okay if someone catches the faith from us, really, even if it's a virulent, highly contagious, ego-resistant form. Actually, it's especially okay if it's a virulent, highly contagious, ego-resistant form. Give it a try, because the whole world will feel better for it. You'll see. Those are the doctor's orders from the divine physician himself, Jesus Christ. There is no armed guard outside of the church doors to keep the faith in. So let's bust out of this quarantine, shall we?